I think it's difficult, particularly in the current job climate. People are often working on book manuscripts and they're between jobs, and there's this idea that this book is going to save me, but at the same time you hate the fact that you're spending years of insecurity and impermanence, and you come back to the same manuscript over and over again. And I felt that certainly, and I felt certainly that at times I got so sick of the idea. Obviously, it's like this idea I had in my early 20s that's now haunting me, that I must bring to a completion. But I think that, and of course I thought about quitting many times, but for practical reasons, for being sick of the topic. But I think fundamentally I realized there was something I really wanted to say, and a relationship between humor and something in the 12th century that I couldn't quite get my head around and that I really wanted to articulate. And that puzzle that had been haunting me, I suppose, just dragged me to the completion. It dragged me to complete. I think I needed bloody-mindedness. I think to complete a project like this, bloody-mindedness, stubbornness, a willingness to get through even the most boring drudgery, and there has to be some belief that it's worth something. But yeah, I don't know. I wrote in the acknowledgements that all the important things about laughter my father taught me, I suppose. I learnt from him. Unfortunately he died 4 years ago, and died before this project was completed, and he would have loved to have sold the book in his shop. He owned a bookshop, a second-hand bookshop. He would have loved to have put it in the window. I think what I learned from my father, really, he was an extremely funny man, extremely laughed a lot. I think he taught us from the youngest age that you must laugh at everything, and really everything. We learnt the parodies of nursery rhymes before we learnt the nursery rhymes. It's like everything was laughable. It was a sense that anything that he held in his hands became laughable just because he was holding it, I suppose he taught us to turn everything that you encounter around and see the funny side. And if you weren't somehow seeing the funny side, then in a sense you weren't actually seeing it at all. I think that's what he taught us, I think. I think that's what all that laughter meant, that it was some way of seeing around a problem, and seeing the whole of what you were approaching. It was extremely important in that way. There's not much that's actually funny in this book, which is really sad. I don't think he would have enjoyed it in that respect, but at least it pays respect to laughter's enormous power, and I owe that to him. I don't necessarily think that they were wrong about anything. I think it's more that scholarship on laughter had tended to emphasize, but on the one hand, it mostly focuses on comic texts. There's not enough humour scholarship on texts that aren't supposed to be funny. So a lot of stuff is looking at comic tales, comic poems, and we can analyse comedy in that situation where there's a predefined setting that is comic. For me, what's much more interesting is quotidian humour, the everyday, where humour pops up uninvited, and that's what I wanted to focus on. I think a lot of scholarship had tended to look at humour in the church more generally, religious texts, and that had been great. The work of Martha Baylis, Janine Horowitz, Sophia Menache, some wonderful scholarship, particularly in France, about humour in ecclesiastical context. There hadn't been much on politics, that's one thing, and there hadn't been much that had taken laughter seriously as a political, as a part of the political process. So I really wanted to emphasise that. It's a bit silly, but there hadn't been much on the 12th century. There's been a lot on the 13th century. The 13th century is seen, it's the summertime of the Middle Ages. It's the time of Thomas Aquinas and St. Francis of Assisi. It's a time when humour becomes formalised and appreciated within Christian context. The Summa Theologiae, Thomas Aquinas writes about how humour is, this sharing in the joy which can be divine, right? So that's great. But the 12th century, it kind of ignored, and I suppose part of me wanted to see the 12th century as, give it some respect, because I think humour becomes so important in political context in the 12th century, in the 1100s. Well, something strange happens in the 12th century. What happens is that suddenly humour pops up in many places, in descriptions of political acts, right? In chronicles of the work of kings, in legal texts, humour suddenly appears. And it seems to have this power as well, or at least it seems to be really important. It's put in important places, it's doing important things. Jokes are making things happen. At the same time, it becomes this topic of analysis in philosophy, in theology, in monastic contexts, in medicine, in rhetoric. Laughter is an interesting and hot topic. So why is your question? Why does it happen in the 12th century? I mean, there are lots of reasons that we could approach. We could approach the fact that more people are reading classical texts, and they're paying great respect to, when they're writing history, for the first time now, they're reading Suetonius' Lives of the Caesars. They're reading other chronicles from the ancient world, where laughter did play an important role. So part of it is imitation. Well, the classics thought that humour was important in politics. Maybe we should give it a place in our accounts of politics as well. Part of it might also be that actually the ideas from the classics are coming to the fore. Aristotle's idea of humour or laughter as being a property of the human comes into play in later 12th century texts. So that's important too. I think in politics, what I identify as being the key thing that changes is actually a culture of alienation. It is on two fronts. On the one hand, we have more and more people in the political class who have got there through social mobility, who were born in more modest circumstances and now find themselves in the corridors of power. Men like, for example, Thomas Becket in the 1160s, who, from a fairly humble background, sort of, becomes Archbishop of Canterbury. And it's this kind of social mobility that produces this kind of alienation. I'm in a setting where I'm making political change, and yet I feel like an imposter. I am a twin man. I think it's Walter Map, the 12th century writer, who talks about this doubling of the self. I have a twin. There's the me that is the formal me that puts on the suits of power, and there's the real inner me, which for Walter, actually, the inner him is a truly spiritual being, a spiritual moral character who wants to reform the world morally, but his twin, his political Machiavellian twin, has to follow the formal codes of power. So on the one hand, that kind of alienation, I think, is ripe for humour to be powerful. That kind of situation where people feel bound. Well, the context demands that I do this, but inside I want to do that. It's explosive humour comes out of that kind of twin thinking. On the other hand, and this is perhaps more important, this is when a huge political change is happening. And we might call it the birth of government as we know it, which is government by protocol, codes, bureaucracy, archive, writing, in other words. To vulgarise this, in a prior period, the presence of a political figure matters more. The word, the charisma of a political figure matters more than the process. With the 12th century, and it's with someone like Henry II in England, where you have a king who's governing a huge empire, he can't be in all places at once, requires this new machinery of government to operate in fairness. It's Henry who invents the legal writs that we have in the common law, the novel decision, mort d'ancestor, these protocols whereby people can get justice by bureaucracy rather than by making a personal appeal. And the use of archive, the use of code. And it's this situation where people feel, well, the code doesn't quite fit the political practice we want. This happens so much, and this is where humour really explodes again. It's where things aren't working the way they should, and sometimes humour can be just the thing, or laughter can be just the thing to expose that disconnect. The issue really is that, some would argue that there's inherently a comic structure in Christianity, and I think this has been argued by too many people. I think I remember seeing Slavoj Žižek talk about this, that basically, there's already this ironic inversion, right, in Christianity, where God has become a human, and not only a human, but a human that is mocked and put on a cross and executed horribly. And this is an inversion, it's irony. I think it's Victor Turner who talked about this, the anthropologist, or, oh my goodness, Patrick Lord, the theologian, about this this inversion which is inherent to Christian structures, that blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. This idea that actually the thing that is scorned or degraded becomes exalted in relief, and so the humour can fit in this model. I mean, a martyr like St. Lawrence is celebrated for, he's being grilled to death and he says, please turn me over, I'm not done fully on this side. And this is kind of a great joke. And this is seen as like, well, yes, it's irony, because because greatness comes in subjecting oneself to the abject, to being low, to being brought low, to being humiliated. This is like a model of Christian virtue. So yeah, this comic inversion we can see as part of the structure of Christianity. But then at a practical level, where does it fit in theology? There's very little in the Bible that says that humour is a positive thing. In fact, it's very negative. I mean, it's woe are those who laugh, they'll come to weep. This is pretty clear from the Sermon on the Mount. Proverbs, laughter is always mingled with grief, always, not sometimes, always mingled with grief. Whenever the scripture discusses laughter explicitly, is negative. And theological glosses are the same. The glossa ordinaria is the same, mostly. So it's at a point of tension. And then there's the other tension. Well, if laughter is a property of the human, if it's really true that to be a human being is to laugh, that there's something inherent about, apparently no other animal laughs. I think Aristotle says the heron laughs, but no other animal. I'm not sure why. If laughter is proper to the human, as Aristotle said, and if Christ was made human, then therefore he must have laughed, right? He must have laughed. But the problem is, laughter is mingled with grief. Laughter always assumes, in this primitive Christian theory, laughter always assumes some victim, some superiority. Like there must be someone you're laughing at or something. And this involves pride. It involves the idea that you yourself can see something that someone else cannot, that your judgment is such that you can kind of mock things. This is a problem. Jesus must have laughed because he's a human, but at the same time that means he was being cruel, so what did he do? Yeah, this is a great question, because I engaged with philosophers of laughter quite a lot, and then when it came to writing the book, I felt that I wanted this to be a theory-making book rather than a theory applying or following or engaging, if you like. I wanted to see what was a medieval philosophy of laughter. Could I reconstruct it? Could I find it? And I suppose then put that in conversation. Putting that in conversation with current philosophers of laughter might be another project. That said, I did engage particularly with Henri Bergson and Georges Bataille. These are kind of outdated thinkers in many ways. I don't think they should be necessary, particularly in the case of Bataille. There was a little bit of pressure from some of the reviewers to maybe update, include more modern theories, or else ditch these guys. But I think these are really important. I think what Bergson gives us is a sense of laughter's role in exposing the mechanical, the artificial, which I think was very important for looking at medieval political contexts, that laughter was precisely the tool that was best equipped to expose and bring into the open, in a problematic way, those parts of politics that were not working and the codes that were not meeting efficacy. And of course, there's the element of the absurd as well, the estrangement from oneself. I think Bergson gives to us with his theory of humour that maybe we laugh at that which we recognize as mechanical in our own being. Like, if I slip on a banana skin, this is always the example, then in Bergson's theory, it's like exposing just how stupid were we for thinking that we could be formal and dignified. We're really clumsy monkeys who slip on fruit. It's like, it draws attention to our own illusions about ourselves. We thought we were so formal and elevated, but really we're not. And I suppose that really hit me for medieval political contexts, that they were aware of this disconnect, that their deep Christian theology gave them a sense of this disconnect between the elevated ideal self of spiritual perfection and the lowly, wayward, sinning self of the current life. And Bataille, of course, gives us a more ecstatic view of laughter and a touch putting in touch laughter and the transcendent in a way that's really fascinating, and which speaks to medieval accounts of mystical laughter, a laughter where there can be no speech, there can be no reason, where there is just this apophatic moment of nothingness, that laughter exposes that laughter, like of the prophet or the mystic, when they reach this ecstatic laughter which has no index, it means nothing. Why? It is not related to any humour, it is just laughter. And Bataille shows us that this is maybe a moment of non-knowledge, a moment of recognizing the supreme nothingness at the heart of human reason, human behavior. I think that my study can show us greater depths of these ideas, even because they are rooted in something so deeply complex as a Christian mystical theology that has extremely profound things to say about the relationship of a human to their own nothingness. I think of the negative theology that's popular in the 12th century, or the annihilation of the self that someone like Bernard of Clairvaux promotes, with the coming to the recognition of the total worthlessness and nothingness of the self in the moment of transcending and becoming one with God. You know, this is something which I think lends itself to a new theory of humour as non-knowledge, which I think is very exciting. You know, on the one hand, like writing any book is so exhausting, and you know, you confront your own stupidity so much. This is the best part about writing a book, isn't it? You are exposed to your own flaws. You're testing your own ability to think and conceive a project and follow it through to your own limit that you're constantly confronted by. This is what I cannot do. And then the reviewers tell you what you cannot do, and the humbling aspect of that is magnificent, and it's wonderful that we have blind peer review that can cut you down to size, and the whole process, I see that in that sense, it's an apprenticeship, isn't it? It's an apprenticeship for becoming a more rigorous thinker and a more honest intellectual. I think at a level of content, what is given to me really, there was a period in the early stages, I suppose, of writing where I started to think, my goodness, you know, all humour must tend towards some greater truth of the soul or something like this, or all humour can ultimately, if done right, lead us to something that will take us out of ourselves and lead us to good ethics. I thought, oh my God, laughter is an ethical act. And there's a limit to how much you can practice that, I think, and there's a limit. But at the same time, I was profoundly moved by the texts, and I will always be profoundly moved by the texts. You know, the reason I study this stuff is because I'm just in love with the 12th century, and I'm in love with the theologians and the monks and all of them, and reading their work as deeply as I was able to across the course of writing this text, and really getting to grips with all of the paradoxes. By looking at a small problem like laughter, I could get to grips with all of the paradoxes in the work of someone like Bernard of Clairvaux, or someone like, maybe not all the paradoxes, but a lot of paradoxes in these writers' work. And that was just extremely exhilarating. I feel much better equipped to navigate the 12th century. Is that useful for my life outside of this building? I don't know. I think I'm less funny than I was. You know, because I see a joke and I just see, you know, a graph. I see blueprints. It's awful. I think it's really relevant, actually, because I think that just to be crassly like present and political, you know, we now have a president in the United States, a prime minister in the United Kingdom, a president in Ukraine, who are all comedians at some level. I feel like comedy and humour and laughter really a part of politics right now in a way that maybe they've always been, but in a much more foregrounded way. I think it's time to take seriously the really heavy political role that laughter and humour can play, and I think that this book can put that into a broad relief. This is not a modern phenomenon. I argue that in the 12th century, humour really did do something really important in making politics work and in offering a shadow power to the new power of bureaucracy and code that was emerging. You could go as far as to say it acts almost as a midwife of the modern state in allowing these things to come into being and to operate effectively. Laughter is almost like a mechanism for allowing, a shadow mechanism that allows these things to work practically. a check and a balance. And I feel that, but also it does something so cynical and so manipulative and so like almost difficult to pin down, a way of communicating political change without making it explicit. A way of telling people things and forcing people to do things without having to tell them to do it or forcing them to do it. A form of extortion without being prosecutable. And I think that these things are really significant for how we think about political changes that are currently taking place, because I think, on the one hand, in big politics, in the high end of politics, these things are happening more and more, and we should be aware of them. We should be aware of how we are seduced through humour and what that seduction does to our political state. We should also be aware that we have power when we use humour, enormous power, when we share memes, when we make jokes. There's a way of seeing these things as like, oh, this is just a safety release valve. You're just like, instead of protesting, you're doing humour. But I think we can take it seriously and see that actually there are capillary and extremely influential ways that humour can operate, can change the way that we do political life. And I think Suetonius talks about this in his Lives of the Caesars, and I think that, it's the idea that, he praises certain Caesars who are able to laugh at themselves and neutralize their opposition through laughing at yourself. I mean, if you make the joke about yourself, if you promote the humor, then on the one hand, you're managing your own critique, but on the other hand, you're kind of taking the weapon away from your critics. I think we're in a current place where there are different kinds of political humor that could operate here. On the one hand, you've got this kind of humor as smoke bomb, like if we just make jokes about our own regime, we make ourselves laughable. If we turn everything into a joke, then where do you make your criticism? You're kind of immunizing yourself from criticism as president or prime minister. And someone like Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom is excellent at doing this. If everything's kind of deflected with a joke, there's this smoke bomb that goes down, where do we target our criticism? How do we mock someone who mocks themselves? On the other hand, I think that there is a good ethics of humour that I hope comes out in the book, that behind a joke lies the truth. A good joke can expose corruption, bad ethics, problems that you could not maybe pin down without the good joke. You can galvanise support as well with a good joke. I think more than ever we need to fight for the right kinds of political jokes and guard against the wrong ones. After so much time with laughter, I'm no longer funny, and so I want a tragic and bleak topic. And I thought about the Black Death, but even bleaker, I think, is democracy. So my next project is about, it's called Dreams of Democracy in the 12th Century. And the idea is to look at ideas of democracy in the 1100s in a new way. I start from the Roman Revolution. This is a really significant moment in the 1140s and 50s where there's a revolution in the city of Rome, and this alliance of people across different classes from the city form a new revolutionary government. It's extremely experimental. They have their own chancellery, their own calendar and dating system. They even have their own script that they use, which is unique from other scripts. But more importantly, they institute a democratic system. Elections every November, every year, 56 senators, 12 councillors, renewable every year, right? And from across the citizenship of Rome, across the whole spectrum of citizens. And it's a really bizarre moment because it's an extremely unique moment in medieval history. It's the most sustained democratic experiment, more or less, between antiquity and the Enlightenment. And yet, this is kind of, I think it's been, rightly, historians are skeptical of looking for democracy in the past. I'm skeptical of that because I think it's silly to impose a modern concept on the past. But what I want to do, rather than looking for like the ideas of Tocqueville or something, or Rousseau in the 12th century, I want to look at the unique medieval ideas of what we might call democracy or representative government or republicanism, what those unique ideas were. And my theory is, on the one hand, these are some pretty strange ideas of what a democracy should look like for us that might teach us to expand our definitions of democracy. On the other hand, they're pretty oblique. So these are discussions of, for example, heaven. What is the nature of the heavenly city? What does paradise look like? And this often becomes an oblique way to indirectly discuss what an ideal political unit might look like. What did the ancient Roman Republic look like? This is another way to imagine what the ideal city in the present might look like. And finally, like descriptions of the animal kingdom. You know, this becomes another way to project these fantasies of democracy onto to displace them. So the idea really is to look at dreams specifically, because these are like absent presences, or these are fantasies which are directed elsewhere of what a political community might be.